We're in the book of Joel. Are you guys there? Good. You all beat me there, and I had it marked. We're in the book of Joel, and when I started looking into, well, what do we know about Joel? There's not much to be known about Joel at all. In fact, what you find about Joel is written in Joel chapter 1, verse 1, and it says, the word of the Lord came to Joel, son of Phanuel, right? And that's the best I got with how I can say it, right? So we know who Joel's dad is, and we know who he is, but we know something about his name too. What it means, anytime you hear that strong L like Joel, it means God is somewhere in that name. And the name Joel means Yahweh is God. And so that kind of points us to my question, like, what do you learn in times of crisis? One thing I want you to learn in times of crisis is that Yahweh is God. And that's what we're going to see throughout the book of Joel, because Joel is prophesying about a plague that's going on in his own time, and he's also looking forward to the future day of the Lord. And in all of this, it's all pointing to the fact that Yahweh is God. And that's what we need to know as we go through the book of Joel, that Yahweh is God, that he's in control. And that's really great, because if God is God, that means you're not, and maybe you can give some control up, right? We're going to try to do that. I started to think this week, like, when you don't know where else to turn, where do you turn to? And I think as people go through crises, they try to figure them out on their own, right? And this week, it's been a week of what I would say is a lot of crises, right? We've had physical crises where people are dealing with some kind of physical issue, like Stan. And we've had like emotional times, right? We have people who are struggling with money situations or with their jobs. We have people who have a crisis within their family. And I've been praying for all of these things this week. We are in a time of crisis. And if you're not in a time of crisis right now in your life, just wait a little bit, because you will experience a crisis, right? And so where do you turn when you have nowhere else to turn to? You remember that Yahweh is God. Right? That God is God, and you're going through this crisis, and he's on the throne, and then you're not. And so we have to change our perspective, because as we go through this time of crisis, it's really easy to focus on the problem. It's really easy to focus on the darkness. And so since this week is we're celebrating Martin Luther King Day, I found a quote from Martin Luther King that I think speaks to this. It's a simple quote. It says, "Only in times of darkness can you see the stars." Right? And that's a really good thought. Like, when you're going through that time of crisis, it's an opportunity for you to really see who God is and how he's moving, right? And Joel gets to see that because the people that Joel is talking to is going through a crisis. Now, Joel writes to the people of Judah, which is the lower kingdom when you're thinking about Israel. Last week when we were in Hosea was writing to the kingdom of Israel, northern kingdom. Now, this prophet goes to the southern kingdom, the people of Judah. And so this is where the mountain of Zion is. And that valley that we look for decision. And so his audience is the people of Judah, and the word of the Lord comes to Joel. Now, I got to move forward or I'm never going to make it through this. But I want you to know that when you're going through crisis, remember Joel. Yahweh is God. Right? That's what it means. In a time of crisis, Yahweh is God. And Joel is experiencing a crisis. The people of Judah are experiencing a crisis. Look at verse 2 with me. Here's what it says. "Hear this, you elders. Listen, all who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days, or in the days of your ancestors? Tell your children, and let your children tell it to their children, and their children to the next generation. What the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. And what the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. And what the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten." And so here's the crisis that we're talking about. They're going through a time of crisis, and it's all about a locust swarm, right? And one thing we're going to learn about this is when they're going through this time of crisis, they can respond in a way that shows faith, right? That's my first point. When you're going through a time of crisis, respond in a way that shows faith. And so Joel goes to the people of Israel, and he says, starts first with the elders, listen to this, and then he tells the people, remember this, and then he asks a question, has anything like this ever happened before? Anybody out there remember any locust plagues anywhere else than the book of Joel? Right? We've heard about them as the people of Israel were in Egypt, right? And God sent a locust plague to show Pharaoh that he is God, right? Pharaoh believed he was, but God sent a locust plague to say, no, I am, right? God used that. And so the answer is yes, we've seen this thing before. A locust plague might mean something. And so what's happening in Judah at this point is that there is a locust plague, and it comes in 4 different stages. It talks about those 4 stages by calling them the locust swarm, the great locust, the young locust, and then the other locusts. Have you guys ever experienced a problem like that where, like, here's the first problem, followed by the second problem, and then the young problem, and then the other problem, right? Now, you may not be able to relate to this because who really has a problem with locusts around here? Like, we have Mormon crickets in Nevada. Have you ever seen them? A swarm of them. In Winnemucca, we used to like sweep them up into garbage cans because there were so many. Like, maybe, I don't know if they come all the way to Carson City, but I grew up in Winnemucca, like there were swarms of Mormon crickets. So thick that when you ran over them on the street, your car would slide. Right? So they had to put like caution signs, like not like caution icy roads, but like full of guts. Like the roads were full of guts. It was nasty. And but the difference between a locust plague and a cricket plague is locusts could fly. So in 1915 there was a locust plague again in Israel, and I have a couple pictures to kind of show you what it was like. This first picture that I'm going to show you, this is a tree that was in Israel before the locust plague. Right? Now, I got these pictures from the Library of Congress, and so they made them look a little nicer. But this is a tree before the locust plague came in 1915. Here's the second picture. This is after the locust plague. You see the difference? Right? Now, there's another picture. This next picture is a picture of all the little locusts. Now, locusts are just large grasshoppers. And do you see what they're trying to get in? Your house. They're trying to like scale the walls of your house, trying to get in there, right? Now, this is still 1915. The pictures aren't so great, so I looked for a current locust plague, and I found one. There was one in Africa, and here's a picture of that. Can you imagine living through that? Like that's a problem. That's a crisis, because when these locusts come, they eat everything. And there's a problem with locusts that eat everything. They don't save any food left over for you. Right? So I found this described the locust plague in 1915. Here's what it says. It says, at the end of February, great clouds of locusts began flying into the land from the northeasterly direction, so that attention was drawn from them by the sudden darkening of the bright sunshine. So many locusts would come that it darked out the sky. Right? They came in enormous numbers, settling in the fields and hillsides. There they laid their eggs in vast numbers. It was calculated that some 60,000 could come from the eggs planted in a 39 square inch of soil. And that figure involved a 30% loss rate. Once hatched, the new brood started crawling across the ground at a rate of 400 to 600 feet per day, devouring every scrap of vegetation in its path. Does that sound like a crisis to you? Like I can't imagine what it would be like to just be a farmer during this time, watching your fields grow, and then all of a sudden this locust plague comes and you have nothing to eat, right? And so what do you do in those times of crisis? Well, it's time to call out. And the first person Joel tells to call out or wake up, if you look at the text, is all the drunks, right? Here's what it says. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you drinkers of wine. Wail because of the new wine, for it has been snatched from your lips. Right? The first person that might need to wake up in this crisis is the people who have been like buzzed through it. Like they don't know what's going on because they've been drunk. And so Joel says, hey, it's time to wake up because all your wine is going to be gone. In fact, it talks about this locust plague as a nation. It says, a nation has invaded my land, a mighty army without number. It has teeth like a lion and fangs like a lioness. It has laid waste my vines and ruined my fig trees. It has stripped off the bark and thrown it away, leaving their branches white. There was nothing left in Israel or in Judah for them to eat. This locust plague took out everything. This is a crisis. And what do you do in those times of crisis? If you look at Joel, he says to mourn, right? That's what it says in verse 8. He says, you're supposed to mourn. Not just a little bit of crying, but mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for her betrothed of her youth. It seems like contradictory terms, like a virgin grieving for her betrothed. This sackcloth is like a coarse material that you put over yourself. It's made out of goat's hair. And so you're supposed to actually visually mourn, like you've lost your loved one, right? Like you've spent your whole life looking forward to your wedding day and it's gone. Why? Because, see, he says you're supposed to mourn like a virgin because there's no grain, no oil, no wine to bring into the temple to even worship. So the covenant people, that their relationship with God is described like a bride and a groom, they can't even worship together. They can't even be together because these locusts have taken out everything. What do you do when something, a crisis in your life, has taken out everything? There's nowhere to hide because the drunkards can't have lost their drink. It's hard to go to God because the locusts have taken everything away you need in order to worship in the first place. In verse 11 it says, despair, you farmers, wail, you vine growers, grieve for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field has been destroyed. The vine is dried up and the fig tree is withered, the pomegranate and the palm and the apple tree, all the trees of the field are dried up. Surely the people's joy is withered away. Do you see how that crisis has taken them from a point where they don't even have joy? Like the locusts have come and they've stripped the land of all its nutrients, but really it's stripped the people of their joy, right? Because the farmers, they were the first to see this locust plague. The farmers were the first to experience it. And now they're looking at everything about their life, and their life is stripped bare. All the joy that they had in that future harvest is gone. And my question is, what do you do when you're experiencing a time of crisis? When you're going through a hard time? And you can focus on the problem, but that's not where Joel goes with it. Joel goes to the people and says, it's time for you to mourn. It's time for you to wail. It's time for you to cry out to God. Right? Because remember what Harry said? Where else are you going to go? I mean, here's an army of locusts, and it's completely out of their control. What are you going to do about it? You can't prevent it, and you can't stop it from happening. You've lost everything. Now, what are you going to do? All you can do is trust. That's the idea that Joel's gotten us to. You've been stripped bare. What are you going to do? All that is left is to trust in God, to respond to Him in faith. Now, I think there are a lot of people who are going through a crisis who are still trying to figure it out on their own, right? And I don't know what your crisis is. I know it's probably not grasshoppers, right? Because we figured out that problem. But you're still trying to figure out your crisis on your own. There are crises that are so big that the only thing left to do is simply trust and to repent and to turn to God. And so if you look at verse 13, it says, put on sackcloth, you priests, and mourn. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Come, spend the night in sackcloth, you who minister before God. The grain offering and the drink offerings are withered from the house of God. See, they can't even worship. Declare a holy fast, a sacred assembly. Summon the elders and all who live in the land to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. That's what you do when you have nothing else to do. You actually cry out to the Lord. And he says, set aside a time to actually do this. This has to be intentional, right? The priests are supposed to gather the people up because they're the ones who are the representatives of God on earth. And they're supposed to gather them up and bring them to the house of the Lord and prepare a sacred assembly, because you have to be intentional about crying out to God in times of crisis. And a lot of times we cry out to God, and our cry is this: God, get me out of this. Have you ever cried that one? Maybe the better thing to ask is, God, what can I get out of this? Because God's the one in charge of the grasshoppers. He's the one who rules over nature. And why are they going through this? What is happening? And the question may be, what can I get out of this? I think our society will often ask the question, why are you doing this to me, God? Right? That's not what these people do. They put on sackcloth, they wail, and they cry out to the Lord. And this is their cry, listen to it, in verse 15. Alas for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. And so they see in this day a future day, right? This is not the day of the Lord, but when they see this crisis, they look forward to a future day that is the day of the Lord. Now, I've been thinking about the day of the Lord because Joel talks about the day of the Lord more than any other prophet, right? It's mentioned 5 times in his book. He mentions the day of the Lord. And I thought, well, like, what is the day of the Lord? We know what the Lord's day is. That's Sunday. That's today, right? You're all here in God's house on the Lord's day. But the day of the Lord is a day that God comes back to judge. He comes back to make a decision. And we find that in Joel chapter 3, where God comes back to make that decision. And how you feel about the day of the Lord really depends on which side of the battle lines you're on, right? And so when they see this crisis, they say, this is pointing us to a different day, a day that God is actually going to come and to make all things new. And sometimes in order to make all things new, you have to start over. Right? And so he talks about them and how they start over as he goes through verse 16. But the point here is that as you go through crisis, it reminds us that there will be a Lord's day. As you go through crisis, you remember that God didn't want it this way. God didn't want locusts to devour their land. He didn't want you to struggle in your marriages or with your finances. He doesn't want you to go through these times of crisis. But when you go through times of crisis, it reminds you that there's going to be a day where God is going to come and he's going to set everything straight. Right? And we look forward to that day when God sets everything straight. Because if you look at verse 17, we're going to skip ahead a little bit. In verse 17, it talks about the Lord's day. And it says, the seeds are shriveled beneath the clods. The storehouses are in ruins. The granaries have been broken down. The grain has dried up. The cattle moan. The herds mill about because there is no pasture. Even the flocks and the sheep are suffering. That's pretty bad, right? When we look at crisis, we wonder, like, why is it happening? And I have to ask, why is it happening to the sheep? Like, why does even the sheep have to be subject to some kind of suffering? They didn't do anything wrong. But as Harry just pointed out, the locust plague affected them too. See, sometimes crisis happen when you have there's no sin to point to. It's not that you did something that caused this to happen. It's just the effects of life. And Paul talks about this in Romans chapter 8. And I was thinking about the sheep crying out because they're hungry. And why doesn't God just take away all the suffering? Like, that's what we want. Why does God allow suffering to happen in the first place? And in Romans chapter 8, Paul answers this. He says this, I consider that our present suffering are not worth comparing to the glory that's going to be revealed in us. So he's saying the suffering that we deal with today is not worth the pleasure that we're going to have in the future, right? For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from the bondage of decay and brought into the freedom and the glory of the children of God. That's Romans 8. And it talks to us about the fact that when sin entered the world, creation itself was corrupted by it. And because creation itself was corrupted by sin, the sheep sometimes don't have enough food. The world suffers. And if you don't believe that, just look around the internet sometimes and you'll see people suffering. And if you're asking why God does this happen, don't think, why God did you allow this to happen? But just consider the effects of sin. And how when sin came into the world, the wages of sin was far-reaching. Not just within you and me. It affected the locusts. And the locusts affected the field. And the field ran out of food. And the sheep themselves suffer because the wages of sin is death. And we look forward to a day where Christ will come back and he will redeem, right? As we see suffering, it should remind us that there's going to be a Lord's day, a day where he comes back and he sets everything right. And so as you see suffering in the world, you remember that that's not how God wanted it. He didn't want the cattle to moan. He didn't want the fields to be barren. In fact, he created the heavens and the earth and he said that they were good. It was sin that caused creation to go into groaning. And when we see that groaning, like the sheep in the field that are crying out with their pants, we're reminded that God didn't want it this way. This is an effect of sin. And there will be a day, which Joel talks about, where God comes to set things right. He calls it the Lord's Day. And what you think about the Lord's Day has a lot to say about what side of the line you're on. Because if you're living opposed to God, you should fear that Lord's Day. But if you're someone who is called out to God, then we have no reason to fear. And that gets pointed out to us, right? As we move on in Joel. We're going to look at Joel chapter 1. I can't believe I'm still in chapter 1. I think the minor prophets might take more time than I thought. But let's look at verse 15. It says, "Alas for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction of the Almighty." So they see in their circumstance that there's going to be a day that God is going to set it right. And then in verse 19, when they consider this Lord's day, here's what they do. It says, "To you, Lord, I call, for fire has devoured our pastures in the wilderness, and the flames have burnt up all the trees of the field. Even the wild animals pant for you. The streams of water have dried up, and the fire has devoured the pastures." And so chapter 2 says, "Blow a trumpet, sound the alarm. Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming." Right? That they look forward to this day of the Lord, and it should cause some kind of trembling because it's close at hand. In verse 2, it talks about a day of darkness, a day of gloom, a day of clouds of blackness, like dawn spreading across the mountain. A large and mighty army comes, such as never was in ancient time, nor will ever be again. And he talks about this day in the Lord, and what do you do about it? As they go through this crisis, what do you do about it? The answer is actually in verse 12 of chapter 2. What do you do about it when you're looking at crisis, when you're considering the day of the Lord? Who can endure it? Verse 12 says, "Even now declares the Lord, return to me with your whole heart, with fasting, weeping, and mourning." If you are going through a crisis and you don't know what to do, if you're considering that future day where God comes to set all things right, and you want to make sure that you're on the right side of the line, even now, says Joel, even now, return to me with your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. There's always time because we have a God who is gracious. And there's time right now because we're living in the time right before this day, right? But he's saying right now, even now there's time to come back. And how do you do it? Verse 13 says, "Rend your heart." Now the people of Israel had this weird custom, and I only think it's weird because I didn't grow up doing it. But when they go through distress, they tear their shirts, right? So you could try that if you're going through a time of crisis. You just tear your shirt, right? I don't know if it'll help. It helps them, right? But God's saying, I'm not really interested in you rending your shirt or tearing your shirt, right? In fact, what he says in verse 13, he says, "Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord, for he is gracious and compassionate and slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity." The answer to this problem of where do I go in suffering lies with a God who is gracious, who is compassionate. And what is he looking for in us? He's looking for us to tear open our hearts, to return to God from deep, deep within inside, not just the outside. It's easy to just tear the outer garment, right? And put off this idea of distress. But the heart, that makes up the seed of a person. He's saying, I want you to show that distress all the way down to your heart, right? One of the things I found interesting about the book of Joel is that it does not tell us what the people did wrong, right? It talks about them returning to God, and it does talk about drunkards at the beginning, but I can't imagine that the entire nation is full of drunkards. That's a tough stretch, right? But it doesn't say what else they might have done wrong. I looked through the book. I can't find anything where God is making the case for this problem. The only thing he says to them is, I want you to tear your hearts and not your garments. And so I'm assuming that maybe the problem of the people of Judah was a problem of the heart. Maybe they were doing everything right. They had all the right sacrifices and all the right forms of worship inside of the temple. And then they knew all the right things to do, but there was something going inside their heart that was wrong. And so Joel says that God declares that you tear your heart and not your garment, that you return to him. And then it shows us God's character. He's compassionate. He's gracious, and he's always willing to forgive. There's so much more that we can see in the character of God, but what we see in these verses is that he is someone who's going to take us back, right? He's slow to anger. And so when it comes to this time of crisis in your life, for the people of Judah, the crisis was a locust plague. But what is the crisis for you? What is it that's causing you to want to tear your garments? What is that moment of distress that you don't know how to get through it, right? I mean, we can see our nation seems like it's in a time of crisis. What are we supposed to do about that? I'm going to tell you, tear your hearts and not your garments. Return to the Lord, because God is slow to anger, he's compassionate, and he's gracious, and he'll gladly take you back. We see in this story a story where the people begin to experience redemption, and it's clear that I need to finish it all next week. But we have a God that is compassionate, right? We have a God that we can say is gracious and abounding in love. And whatever it is that you're going through, you can't get through it on your own. You need to tear your hearts, not your garments, and return to the Lord. He's the one that can make things right. You can't do it on your own.